This is the PowerPoint video for Chapter 16. I wanted to start this chapter with a quote by Thomas Jefferson. What a stupendous and what an incomprehensible machine is man. Man can endure toil, famine, stripes, imprisonment, and death itself in vindication of his own liberty, and the next moment inflict on his fellow men a bondage 1 hour of which is fraught with more misery than ages of that which he rose in rebellion to oppose. And so this is making reference, of course, to the Revolutionary War. And when he's talking about man can endure toil, famine, stripes, imprisonment, death itself in vindication of his own liberty, the Revolutionary War, fighting for our own liberty, and then in the next moment just turn around and inflict upon others bondage, which, let's see here, bondage 1 hour of which is fraught with more misery than any rebellion, or any of which the rebellion opposed. Revolutionary War. So anyway, this is a great quote by Thomas Jefferson, especially looking at the dichotomy that is Thomas Jefferson and the inconsistencies within his own life. Chapter 16 deals with slavery, 1793 to 1860. It gets right up to the point right before the Civil War. Civil War starts in 1861 when Lincoln is elected. Another quote here by Ralph Waldo Emerson. If you put a chain around the neck of a slave, the other end fastens itself around your own. Anyway, chapter 16 is a fascinating chapter, and this is the video for that chapter. A reminder that all the video links and also images within this PowerPoint are in the public domain. The chapter starts off with the theme of cotton in the South, and cotton being king. So this idea that cotton is king, and gin, the cotton gin, is the throne. And there's a couple of good illustrations here that you can look at. So combing the cotton, the excessive cotton combing, and the things that, the ramifications from that. And then also we have this. And of course you can look at the cotton bales here in Virginia. And these are all the cotton bales here. This is all on the eve of the Civil War. But we're going to spend some time looking at the idea that cotton, and in some ways sometimes described as cottonocracy, but the cotton is so important to slavery. So slaves of a slave system, page 340 in your textbook. I want to read you this quote. Southern planters resented watching the North grow fat at the South's expense. They were pained by the heavy outward flow of commissions and interest to Northern middlemen. This is key. The Northern middlemen, bankers, agents, and shippers, they were the ones making all the money. True souls of the South, especially by the 1850s, deplored the fact that when born, this is the Southerner, when the Southerner was born, they were wrapped in Yankee swaddling clothes, and they spent the rest of their lives in servitude to the Yankee factories. And then when the Southerners died, they were laid in coffins held together by Yankee nails and were buried in graves dug with Yankee shovels. So slaves of a slave system, this is going to become very clear closer and closer to the Civil War, when the North has all the transportation advantages, the North has the population, the North has the factories, and the North also then has the population and the money, the banking system, everything, all the advantages. So the slaves of a slave system was a pretty good description of the South. So King Cotton led to this excessive cultivation. The cotton crop left the land barren And so King Cotton caused financial instability and overspeculation in land and slaves, then large debt. Of course, this debt then was owed to northern banks in a lot of situations. And then another thing here, the Planter Aristocracy, and the idea that in 1850, again, the Civil War is in 1861, but only 1,700 families owned more than 100 slaves each. And this select group provided the cream of the political and social leadership of a section and nation. So the idea that most people of the South didn't necessarily own very many slaves. It was a very select group of families, but that select group of families were the political and social leaders of the South. The mint julep South and the tall columned and white painted plantation mansions, this is where this idea of cottonocracy existed. So just a couple of interesting points to start off this chapter, and we'll move to the next slide. Now this is a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I do not see how a barbarous community and a civilized community can constitute a state. So I think we must get rid of slavery, or we must get rid of freedom. And this quote is put together, of course, in 1856, just 5 years before the Civil War. But just this feeling of a northerner, a New Englander, who is getting less and less comfortable with any notion of compromise, that we must either get rid of, not compromise, but get rid of slavery, abolish slavery, or we must say that slaves can exist everywhere. And he knows that that's not an option. In your textbook on page 348, there's a section that talks about the burdens of bondage, and it mentions a couple of slave revolts that occurred, Nat Turner's rebellion, but it also very briefly tells the story of the Amistad. Hopefully you'll have a chance at the very least to read some about this case. If not, maybe even watch the movie. Movie has Sir Anthony Hopkins, plays the part of John Quincy Adams, and he argues a case before the Supreme Court as an ex-president. The other characters are just loosely based off of historical people, but John Quincy Adams, played by Anthony Hopkins, is a good role. And this ship, the Amistad, has slaves on board, and they are illegally captured, and so the story is a court case about their fight for freedoms. But some very good dialogue within that movie. So if you have a chance, please watch that movie. At the very least, a preview of that movie is included, or a link is, in your Chapter 16 worksheets. So your Chapter 16 does spend some time looking at some of the worst parts of slavery, especially the idea that slaves are traded, families are broken up, the auctions of slaves was probably the worst part of slavery, and just the social aspects of slavery in the South are touched upon in this chapter. So hopefully you'll find time to read through that as well. Moving to the next slide. This right here is an image of a famous collar that would be placed upon slaves that demonstrated the likelihood of trying to escape, placed upon their head, placed upon their neck, to make sure that they would make noise wherever they went. And these were popular in particular closer and closer to the Civil War, when the idea of escaping was tempting. Some more images here, cotton field, and then of course the actual middle passage, the passage that occurred maybe from Africa to the islands in the Caribbean, or in fact the passage from the Caribbeans to the United States. On page 350 of the textbook, it talks about some of the more radical abolitionism that existed, and you had, of course, then some slave revolts that occurred, Desmond Vesey, Nat Turner. These are, I think, on page 348, but I also wanted then to look at the various abolitionists, John Randolph and Henry Clay, the founders of the ACS. This was the American Colonialization Society, founded with the purpose of forming the Republic of Liberia, in which slaves could be sent back to Africa. Its capital, Monrovia, was named after the current president at the time, President Monroe. Other abolitionist societies, the anti-slavery societies, the various publications like the Liberator also exists to kind of publicize some of these various anti-slavery societies. But a lot of that information is on page 348, 349, and getting into page 350. Next slide. And so the American Colonialization Society tried to move former slaves back to Africa, and then also you have the publication, the Liberator, and this is a northern publication that tended to call attention, of course, to the cause of abolition. William Lloyd Garrison was the publisher of the Liberator, and this publication came out of Boston. So some of the leading abolitionists: William Lloyd Garrison, and a quote, "I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. Time for compromise and moderation is over. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." So in the movie Amistad, there's a character in there that is loosely based off of William Lloyd Garrison, and the time for compromise is over. And this gets close to after, like around this time period of leading up to Compromise of 1850, in response to the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, and finally some of these abolitionists up north are questioning whether the time to actually fight civil war is now. Frederick Douglass, the greatest of all black abolitionists, born as a slave in Maryland, escapes to the north and becomes a gifted orator, writer, and editor. Actually, during the Civil War, does have an opportunity to meet Abraham Lincoln. We also then have Sojourner Truth, a freed black woman in New York who fought tirelessly for black emancipation and women's rights. These are kind of the big three, chapter 16, and they are mentioned on page 352. So spend some time reading through this chapter, answering the questions. Hopefully you'll have a chance to watch the movie Amistad or the movie 12 Years a Slave. This chapter is just to call your attention to the existence of slavery in this time period leading up to the Civil War, and call your attention to some of the more specific things in the South as are concerned with slavery. That concludes the video for Chapter 16. Just a reminder that all images within this PowerPoint are in the public domain. If you have any questions, give me an email or a phone call. Thank you.